Okay, so I want to walk you through the next step for your text-based RPG. So you've started to create some classes. You've got your hero class, and you're now adding classes for monsters and items and things like that. And then the question is, how do you take all of this and actually implement it into your game? So I've completed kind of a rudimentary game of my own. It's not quite as interesting as some of the stuff you guys are making, but it should give you some of the basic principles. So I want to go through a few things with you. In this first video, we're going to talk about the creation of some of these new classes and some of the things we might want these classes to do. In the second video, we're going to look at the creation of a combat system function that'll take some elements from these classes and then do a little bit of math and kind of work out how combat's going to work. And then in the third video in this part of the series, we're going to look at how to put it all together. So you created your hero class last time. So I want to try to create a couple of other classes. In this case, I'm going to create a class for monsters, treasure chests, and items. So I'm thinking I'm going to create an RPG where there will be a treasure chest that needs to be unlocked by a key that's held by one of the monsters, and that treasure chest is going to contain items that'll help me to defeat a boss monster like a dragon or something like that. So in order to make those monsters, I need a generic monster class, and that's what I've got right here. So the first thing I do in this class is I define its initializer. Remember, this is what I call when I create one of these monsters. So I always start with self, and then I'm going to add the attributes that I want to initialize for that monster. In this case, name, what's the monster going to be called, how many hit points does it have, what is its description, is the monster alive or dead, and what loot does that monster carry. Now the one that's probably strange for you here is dead. And I'll explain this a little bit more later on, but what I wanted was an attribute that would tell me in my program whether or not I've already fought this monster, because I don't necessarily want this monster to spawn every time I enter into a section of my game. I'm going to create the monster outside of my game loop and then have a check as to whether or not the monster is still alive within my game loop. Now, you can do this in other ways. Many of you already have, but this is the way that I decided to do it. And then loot is going to be a list that contains the loot that that monster carries. And then I'm going to create a class function, a class method called change hit points that will take the self for the class. So it basically will take in the monster, and then it will take in the value of the hit points that we want to change. Now, the way that I have my fight set up, I have it set up where if the monster's score on a random roll is greater than the player's score, then the monster wins. And then if the player's score is greater than the monster's score, the player wins. And so what happens is when the player wins, the score is a positive. The damage is a positive number. So if the player's roll is, say, a 6 and the monster's roll is a 4, I subtract the 4 from the 6, I get a positive 2, and then that's the value that I take off of hit points. So I want to subtract this, where in my previous one I added, in the one that I did for my change hit points for my hero, because in this case it's a negative number, and so when I add that negative number it's like subtracting. So it's just a little bit of logic there you have to think about on how this is going to work, but trust me, this does work. And so I have my monster's hit points minus the value on this change hit points function, and then I print out how many hit points the monster has remaining. So that's pretty self-explanatory. Now when I want to create my monsters, I'm going to go down to a line later on where I create a monster. So down here I've created two monsters. I created a bat and a dragon. So I call my monster function, or my monster class, and I put in the name bat. It's got hit points of 5. It's described as a sinister looking vampire bat that flies towards you baring its teeth. It is not dead, and it has a key. And then I create a dragon that I define as named dragon, hit points of 40. Description: suddenly in front of you appears a great green dragon. It roars at you, smoke coming out of its nostrils. It is not dead, and it carries treasure. So these two are being called outside of the game loop. And what this does is, as Python goes through and it runs my program, it'll create these before it jumps into the game loop. So these are only created once. If you, for example, wanted to have kind of a randomizer where, you know, maybe 50% of the time if you enter a certain section of your game, a monster will appear, you would do that inside your game loop. And you would do something like have a function like a random.randint 1, 2, and then if the random integer is 1, the bat appears. If the random integer is 2, then it does not appear. And you would do that within the game loop when you wanted that monster to appear. So there are lots of ways you can do this. For my purposes here, I'm creating single monsters and then I'm killing single monsters. Okay, so the other classes that I'm making here, I've got a class for a chest, and I've got an initializer that contains a variable that tells me whether or not the chest has already been opened, and it contains a list that contains the chest's contents. And then I've got a class method called plunder, where I take all of the contents of the chest and I add those contents to my hero's inventory. Now, for my purposes here, I'm going to create a lot of items that will add hit points to my hero. That'll basically make my hero stronger, like a sword and a shield. And so I want to add the item bonus from those items to my hero's inventory when that item is added to the inventory. And then my last class that I've made here is a class for item. And for this class, I take self, like you always do, and then I have the name for the item, a description of the item, and the bonus that that item gives. Now notice this bonus is the thing that is added here when you plunder the chest, because if the item is found in the chest, that item will give you the bonus. And so I have an add bonus function in here, which in this case I don't use, but if, say, you found an item somewhere on the ground, you could call the add bonus from that item. And actually I probably could do it right here where I say item.addBonus. In fact, that's probably a better way to do it anyway. Item.add underscore bonus item.bonus. Actually, in this case, it would be, yeah, it would be item.bonus. So those are my classes. I'm going to stop here. Try to create some of your own classes with some interesting class methods, and then the next one, in the next one, I'm going to go through the function that I created for battle.